Hello, Mandela, and welcome to your first wider curriculum lesson of the week. Today, our learning objective is: can I identify and compare Victorian punishments to the modern day justice system? What punishments do we have in the modern day for people who break the law? What I'd like you to do is grab a piece of paper or your whiteboard, and I'd like you to make a mind map to show me some of the punishments that we have today for people who break the law. Pause your video and make your mind map. So let's have a look. So some of the modern day punishments we have are prison sentences, where people get sent to prison for a period of time. We have fines, where people have to pay some money. We have community service, where people are given jobs to go out into the community to do, and people can also get arrested. What do you think life would be like if we didn't have prison, police, the courts of law, CCTV, or rights for prisoners? Pause your video and see if you can tell Mr. Fox what life would be like if we didn't have prison, if we didn't have the police, if we didn't have courts of law, if we didn't have CCTV, and if we didn't have rights for prisoners. Pause your video now. So, if we didn't have prison, the police, the courts of law, or CCTV, people would think they could do exactly what they want and do things that weren't making good choices. If we didn't have rights for prisoners, it means that prisoners wouldn't be treated fairly. So, the police force was first introduced in London in 1829. Sir Robert Peel introduced them as part of a campaign to improve public law. These policemen were called bobbies or peelers by 1839. Other areas of the country were developing their own police force. The policemen or peelers wore long blue coats and tall hats that were strengthened to protect them from blows to their head. Their only weapon was a truncheon, such as these shown in the picture below. So they had truncheons to protect themselves. The Victorians worried about crime. However, they were growing increasingly angry about people being hanged as punishment, especially if they had only committed a small crime. This created some problems. How should criminals be punished? The important fact here is that if a child committed a crime, they would receive the same punishment as an adult. This definitely doesn't happen now. I wonder what the Victorians did to overcome that problem of how Victorian criminals should be punished. Here are some Victorian punishments: imprisonment, which means they were sent to prison; hard labour, which means they had to do some work; physical punishment, which means they could be hurt; send into the armed forces; fines, or transportation. Let's find out a little bit more about these punishments. Imprisonment. During the Victorian period, Prison had become the main form of punishment for lots of different crimes. It was also seen as a way to prevent crime. Life in a Victorian prison was extremely tough. Even people who were put into prison for less than 3 months had to do hard labour. This meant carrying out very physical, demanding jobs in complete silence, and often there was no purpose for it at all. Did you know that prisoners were kept in their own cells for most of the time? When they were allowed out, such as for exercise, they were not allowed to see or talk to each other. Hard labour. Criminals were made to complete tasks that were hard and tiring. Criminals would be sentenced for just a few days, weeks, or even years. Prisoners were also sent to hard labour within the prisons. Hard labour's tasks were different on whether or not you were in prison. So here we've got the crank, so they would have to turn the handle. And here we have a prison treadwheel with some prisoners on it being watched by the guards. So hard labour. Let's compare what it was like if you weren't in prison and if you were in prison. So if you weren't in prison, you would be made to do things that would help society. For example, building roads, working in the quarry, working down at the docks. If you were in prison, you would be made to do things that were usually pretty pointless. For example, the treadwheel, moving a huge wood and iron wheel with steps. The prisoner had to step on them with all his weight to make the wheel move. Short drill, which was lifting a heavy iron cannonball and then moving 3 paces to the right, then putting it down. Then you had to move back 3 paces and repeat the task again. Picking oakum, which was pulling apart tarred rope so that it could be used again. The crank. So if you had to turn that crank, you had to turn it 10,000 times a day to earn your meals for the day. Physical punishment. For a short time in Queen Victoria's reign, the authorities believed that whipping was a just and humane punishment for criminals. This would usually be done in private. Before she was on the throne, physical punishment would be done in front of crowds in order to deter people from committing crimes. And here we have a picture of a whipping device. So people would be put onto this before they were whipped. If you were sent to the armed forces, this is what it would be like for you. In time of war, it was often difficult to recruit people to the armed forces, especially to the Navy, as people knew how hard the conditions were on board ship. Some prisoners were therefore sentenced to serve in the forces. Fines. This was not a common form of punishment because many people were poor and couldn't afford to pay. Victorians also believed that hard labour was a better way to show that the criminal had been punished. Transportation. Those who had committed terrible crimes and had a sentence of 7 years or longer would often be transported to one of the countries colonised by the Victorians, for example, Australia. It could take several months to get to Australia, and conditions on the ships were not great. Once the criminals arrived, they were put to work and had to do a lot of hard labour. Colonised means to send people from one country to another to take control of it. Let's read some real stories. This is Henry Caitlin. In 1842, when he was 14 years old, Henry Caitlin was sentenced to be transported to Van Diemen's Land, or Tasmania, for 14 years, all because he had stolen 17.5 pence. Do you think this was fair? Pause the video and give Mr. Fox your opinion as to whether you think this was a fair punishment for Henry. Let's read another real story. This is John Walker. He was charged with theft as he stole onions valued at between 4 and 5 shillings. He appeared for trial on the 8th of April 1874 and was sentenced to 7 years imprisonment and 7 years police supervision. That means someone would watch him for 7 years, all for stealing some onions. Do you think that was fair? Pause your video and give Mr. Fox your opinion. Your task. I'd like you to grab a piece of paper and set your piece of paper out to look like this. You need to use a ruler to draw your table. You need to have 3 columns, 1, 2, 3. And you need to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rows. In the first column, you're going to write the letters A, B, C, D. Then you're going to write the heading Victorian judge and modern day judge. Pause your video while you draw the table. Your task today. You are going to be the judge. There will be 4 crimes. You are going to be in charge of what will happen to each person. Write down what punishment you would give for their crime as a Victorian judge and what punishment you would give as a modern day judge. Remember, in the Victorian era, children would have the same punishments as adults. So you're going to be the judge. You're going to be in charge of what happens to each of these persons. You've got to use what you know about Victorian punishment and what you know about punishment today to help you reach your decision, to help you reach your judgment. Let's look at our first case. Martha is 9 years old and an orphan. An orphan means she hasn't got any family. She was caught stealing bread from the market. She said she did it because she was hungry. What should her punishment be? What you need to do now is pause your video. You need to write down what would happen to her if you were a Victorian judge and what you think should happen if you are a judge today. Pause your video and have a go at looking at that, and then we will read our next case that we need to make a judgment on. Let's read our second case. Oliver is 11 years old. He was caught pickpocketing a very expensive watch from a gentleman. He claims he was told to do it by his father. What should his punishment be? I want you to pause your video and complete the table, thinking about what would happen to Oliver if we were in Victorian times and what would happen to Oliver today. Pause your video and jot down your ideas. Let's look at our next case. Sally and Lillian are twins. They are 17 years old. They were caught breaking into a house. They claimed they don't have a home and needed something warm to wear as it's winter. What should their punishment be? So think about what would happen to Sally and Lillian in Victorian times and think about what their punishment could be today. Pause your video and fill in your table. And let's look at our final case, the case of Michael, who was 20 years old, and John, who was 22 years old. They were caught fighting in the middle of the street. Police had to intervene. That means the police had to step in. What should their punishment be? Pause your video and write down what you think would happen to Michael and John in Victorian times, and then think about what their punishment would be today. Extension. So I'd like you to have a go at thinking about this question and see if you can write a paragraph to give me your opinions. Do you think Victorian punishments were fair? Why? So have a go at seeing if you can write a paragraph to explain if Victorian punishments were fair and why. I'm really looking forward to seeing what punishments you think are criminals should have from the Victorian era and how they would be punished today. Remember to upload your work onto Tapestry.